Hey guys, I thought it might be fun to do something a little different for this video. I've always loved TV shows and comics that have a horror host that introduces the stories at the beginning. The Crypt Keeper, the Old Witch, Elvira, Vampira, even that little cockroach and maggot from that kids show, Grizzly Tales for Gruesome Kids, or Freaky Stories, or something like that. So I thought it might be fun to do something in that style and continue the tradition. I was scouring the internet for creepy tales about Christmas when I came across a website called Scary for Kids. I'll link it below in case you want to read some of the stories for yourself. It doesn't seem to be too active anymore, but there's some good stuff on there. I came across a lot of stories that were based on the older horror comics from the 50s and 60s. So after reading through a couple, I thought it'd be fun to share some of my favorite ones with you. So sit back, relax, maybe grab a drink, and I hope you enjoy these stories too. This first one's called The Bloody Axe. I remember that Christmas when I was 8 years old, like it was yesterday. I remember how I would lie very still under the old moth-eaten quilt my mother made. I was wide awake and listening for those familiar sounds, the thump of the front door closing, the clomp, clomp, clomp of my father's mud-caked boots on the stairs, and the sound that, to this day, still fills me with revulsion and horror. Drip, drip, drip. And then my father would pass by my doorway, and the light from the hall would cast his shadow and the shadow of a bloody axe against my wall. The next morning, I would eat my watery oatmeal in the wintry chill of our kitchen and ask my mother, very slowly and carefully, "Where was Dad last night?" She would just look at me with her sad gray eyes, but she never said a word. After breakfast, I got ready for the day and set about doing my share of chores around the farm. My father never did much work himself. He always seemed to be busy with other matters. On those chill, windy mornings, as the snow began to fall, I had a lot of time to think. At school, I couldn't pay much attention to my lessons. I was always lost in my own troubling thoughts. When I got home in the evening, I had arrived just in time to see my father leaving, his axe clutched tightly in his hands. I rarely saw my father during daylight hours, and at night, all I ever saw was his shadow. I can still vividly recall that terrible night when I was awakened by the sound of the shutters on my bedroom window clattering in the screaming December winds. When I got up to close the shutters, I happened to glance over at the barn and noticed a shadow in the darkness. It was my father, and he was putting something into the feed box we use for the cattle. I returned to bed and lay awake long into the night, puzzled by what I had just seen. Eventually I fell into a tortured and troubled sleep. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. I took the key that hung on the hook in the kitchen and opened the feed box. I remember standing and staring for several seconds at the foul-smelling, bloody pulp inside, trying to understand why my father would put parts of a slaughtered animal into the feed box. Then, I noticed something that struck horror into the pit of my soul. Jutting out of the bloody mess was a severed human hand. From that moment, I was filled with a nameless dread. I no longer looked at my parents with trust, but with a dark, creeping suspicion. I began to notice things that had previously escaped my attention. newspaper headlines that spoke about brutal murders and discovered bodies, overheard conversations about a bloodthirsty fiend on the loose. And finally, I heard a boy at school utter 2 words that repeated over and over in my mind. Axe murderer. That night, my sleep was invaded by shapeless horrors. In these nightmares, I saw 2 images that haunted me constantly. The face of my father and an axe dripping with blood. Unable to sleep, I got out of bed and crept downstairs. I took my father's axe from the fireplace, dimmed the lights, and crouched in the darkness at the top of the stairs. It seemed like an eternity before I heard the front door swing open, then close. I listened for those familiar footsteps on the stairs. Clomp, clomp, clomp. Stepping out of the darkness, I raised the axe above my head and brought it crashing down. In the eerie silence that followed, I listened for the sound of any movement from my parents' bedroom. I hoped against hope that my mother had heard nothing. The only sound I heard was the creaking floorboards beneath my feet and the pounding of my heart. I looked for the last time at the headless body that lay crumpled at the bottom of the stairs, and then quietly tiptoed back to my bed. Early the next morning, I was awoke to the sound of strange voices in our hallway. Silently, I crept to the top of the stairs and peered at the scene below. A group of policemen were crowded around my father's bloody corpse. My mother was standing beside them, watching silently. No one was paying attention, but when she glanced up, she noticed me. Then, very briefly and very discreetly, she gave me a knowing wink. Well, I hope everything works out for the young boy and his mother. And I guess for the cattle that was helping them out with their father's crimes. Sorry, things got a little hairy there near the end, but nothing to lose your head over, right? And this next one's actually based off a old episode of Tales from the Dark Side, Seasons of Belief. It's about a legendary monster that lives beneath the ice, deep within the North Pole. It was Christmas Eve, and the family was gathering in the living room. The father was reading the newspaper, and the mother was knitting a sweater. The children, Jimbo and Steffa, were stretched out on the floor with their crayons and coloring books. "Tell us a story," Steffa demanded. "Yeah, a scary one," Jimbo insisted. "All right," their father said. "I'm going to tell you about the most fearsome, dangerous, and appalling creature in the world. And it's called the Grither." "Oh, now you've done it," said their mother. "You said his name out loud." "Who is he?" asked Jimbo. "He's the most awful thing in the world," their father answered. "He lives in a cave at the North Pole, the coldest, wettest place in the world. He sleeps in the wreck of a ship that somehow got squeezed into the mouth of the cave. He doesn't mind the cold, and then he doesn't mind the wet. But the thing he hates the most is to hear someone say his name. He has very good ears, and they get bigger every time his name's spoken anywhere on Earth. Sometimes his ears get so big, he can use them to fly." "I don't like this story," Steffa whined. "It's too late now," her mother said. "We've already mentioned his name. The Grither's probably already on his way to our house this very minute." "It'll probably take him a while to get here," their father said. "If we finish the story before he gets here, everything will be fine." Do you know why the Grither's called the Grither? The children didn't. Because he has fists as big as basketballs and his arms long as boa constrictors, said their father with a grin. Whenever he finds the people who have spoken his name, he opens up his fists and reaches his arms out, and he grithers them in. He grabs them by the head and squeezes them until they pop, just like a balloon. Does he look like Bigfoot? Jimbo asked. No, said father. He's not like Bigfoot, and he's not like the abominable snowman either. Nobody knows what he looks like for sure. The only people who have ever seen the Grither are the people the Grither's eaten. He's as tall as a tree, but he can bend all the way over and touch the ground. His skin looks like a road map because it's transparent and all his blue and red veins show through. The blues for fear and the reds for rage. Hurry up and finish the story before he gets here, Steffa cried. The Grither was born on a sailing ship, said their father. It was blown off course by a storm and got lost in the Arctic Sea. They drifted around for weeks and never saw anything but glaciers and icebergs. Some of the passengers drowned, some froze to death, some even starved. The Grither was born out of the fear and rage of all those people. But why does he kill people? Jimbo asked. Nobody knows. He just doesn't like anyone telling his story. Is that all? Steph asked. Is that the end of the story? Not quite, said their father. There's only one way to protect yourself from the Grither. Maybe you should stop, their mother interrupted. I think you've scared them enough. Their father chuckled. You don't believe in the Grither, do you? No, the children lied. Well, you shouldn't, their father said, because I made it all up. There's no such thing as the Grither. But you didn't finish the story, Steffa whined. All of a sudden, the front door blew open, and the room was enveloped in an icy blast of wind. There was a crash and a sound of breaking glass. Then, two huge, gnarled arms reached in through the windows and grasped their parents by their heads. As the children watched in horror, the hands squeezed and squeezed, and their parents' heads popped, just like balloons. So, the Grither. Real? Made up. Whatever you think, you may want to keep it to yourself, just in case he's out there and hears you. I imagine Jimbo and Steffa probably feel that way now. Our last story of the night is called Christmas Tree Decorations. It's a story about a girl home alone on Christmas Eve when she has an encounter with someone claiming to be Santa Claus. It was Christmas Eve, and Juliet, a young French girl, was decorating the Christmas tree. Her mother was working as a nurse at a local hospital, and the two of them lived alone in a small apartment in the suburbs of Paris. Late that evening, Juliet's mother called to let her know that she wouldn't be home until much later that night. The young girl didn't mind and continued to decorate the tree with all the lovely things her mother had bought at the shop earlier that day. She draped some multicolored Christmas lights around the tree and hung beautiful ornaments on the branches. After placing the angel on top of the tree, she finally finished decorating and sat down to relax and watch some TV. Even though she was all alone in the 6th-floor apartment, Juliet felt safe as she gazed across the lights of the Parisian skyline. From her window, she could see the Eiffel Tower and the Champ de Mars. Most of the other tenants in the building had gone home to spend Christmas Eve with their relatives in the countryside. The apartment building was almost deserted. Juliet was growing bored, waiting for her mother to return, when suddenly she thought she heard a scratching noise at the front door. She turned down the television and listened closely. There was an eerie silence. Curious, she slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. To her surprise, she saw a man standing outside. He was dressed in a red suit with fluffy white trim. He was large and fat, with a dirty gray beard. As she watched, he knocked at the door loudly. Nervous and concerned now, she asked through the door, "Who's there?"
"It's Santa,"
the man replied.
"Let me in. I'm cold and tired, and I'm hungry."
At this, a chill went down Juliet's spine. She wasn't an idiot. She knew that whoever this guy was, he wasn't Santa Claus. "My mother isn't home right now," she said, her voice shaking. "Please leave." Peering through the peephole, Juliet watched as the man's eyes filled with anger and his face twisted into a grimace of hate. He began knocking on the door even harder and rattling the doorknob.
"It's Santa Claus, Juliet. Have you laid out some milk and cookies for me, Juliet?"
The young girl had a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. How did he know my name? Then the man began kicking and pounding at the door. She peeked out again and saw him reach into his coat pocket and pull out a switchblade. He shoved the knife into the keyhole and he tried to pry it open. Juliet was horrified. She didn't know what to do. "If you don't go away, I'll call the police." All of a sudden, the knocking stopped. Juliet stood perfectly still, afraid to move. Minutes passed, and she started to think that the man might have been scared away by her threat. Slowly, she approached the door and looked through the peephole to see if he was really gone. The hallway stood empty. And suddenly, she saw the man running down the hall with an axe in his hand. Juliet screamed and ran to the closet in panic. She could hear the man trying to smash the front door in. There was a mighty crack as the door gave way and the man came crashing through the splintered wood. Laughing to himself, he called out,
"Juliet, where are you? Juliet, don't be afraid. Where are you hiding?"
The crazed intruder walked around the house, searching for the frightened girl. Juliet curled up in the closet, trembling with fear. Suddenly, the handle of the closet moved up and down. Then the door began shaking, and she heard the man laughing.
"Juliet, I know you're in there. Open up for Santa."
The man swung his axe, and it struck the closet door with a huge bang, tearing into the flimsy wood. Juliet screamed and began crying bitterly. She grabbed a wire coat hanger and twisted it into a point. She waited, her eyes open wide and her hands were trembling. There was another loud crash, and the closet doors gave way in a hail of splinters. The horrible man tore the doors off their hinges and thrust his head in between the coats. He was laughing and drooling like a madman as his huge, gnarled hands grabbed at the horrified girl. Juliet held up the pointed end of the coat hanger and bravely thrust it into the man's face. It went straight into his eye. He recoiled in pain, screaming with rage as blood flowed down his cheek. He ripped the wire out of his eye socket and grabbed Juliet by the hair. Then he dragged her, kicking and screaming, out of the closet. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and he whispered in her ear,
"I've got a list, and I've checked it twice. I'm here to decide if you've been naughty or nice."
It was after midnight when Juliet's mother returned home. She saw the front door hacked to pieces and rushed inside to look for her daughter. Gazing around at the carnage, her eyes struggled to take it all in. And then she began screaming in absolute horror. The Christmas tree was decorated with Juliet's entrails, and her severed head was glowing brightly, perched on top. Hey guys, sorry that last one took a turn for the worse there, but I'm sure Juliet's fine. It's just a made-up story anyways, right? I hope you enjoyed. I've always been fascinated with ghost stories, so hopefully you guys will like this and maybe I can share some more with you. Anyways, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and I hope you have a good night. Bye.